This is a tour of my 1954 Citroen Traction Avant. This is a Light 15, so it's a car that was made in Britain and it was built in 1954. So it was one of the last of these cars built before they stopped production and moved over to the DS. I've owned this car about 4 years and I've actually just sold it. It's off to its new owner tomorrow, and so this was my last opportunity to take a video of the car and walk through some of the quite interesting features on these cars. They were highly revolutionary when they came out in 1934, and even by 1955 they weren't hugely out of date other than the styling, which was starting to get quite old-fashioned looking. When these cars came out in 1934, they were really revolutionary. One of the first things that was different to most other cars on the market is that they're front-wheel drive, and you can actually see in here, that's actually the transmission sticking out the front. It's a 3-speed manual transmission, and that allows the front-wheel drive configuration, because unlike modern front-wheel drive cars, it's a longitudinal engine with the transmission out the front. For 1934, it also had independent front suspension as well as being front-wheel drive, and the long wheelbase for its size gave it really good road holding. Even today, taking the car out in long winding country roads, it has more grip and more road holding than a car of this age or size really should have. The other feature that was fairly revolutionary was that it was basically a monocoque design, and you can sort of see here, if we look in the engine compartment, there's not a separate chassis. You had the what they call the jambonneau coming out the front, and the engine and radiator and so on sat on a subframe that could be sort of wheeled away with the front wheels of the car. The engine was again quite revolutionary when it came out. It's a 1911cc overhead valve 4-cylinder unit. For 1954 it put out 56 horsepower, and it was fairly low compression, I think from memory in the 6s, based on the fuel that you could get at the time. Now this is a British built car, so it has 12 volt electrics. The French built cars had 6 volt electrics, but the British built cars had 12 volts, which again was fairly unusual for a car of this price at the time that it was produced. You can see there's a lot of, because this car was made in Britain, there was a lot of British content, even though the engine and the body was made in France. All the electrics are Lucas, all the things like the the air cleaner and the radiator, and at the time when it was new, obviously the battery and so on were all locally built. Now if we continue having a look around the car, this is called a Light 15, so this is the small-bodied 4-cylinder car. There was a few other varieties, but basically there was a small body and a big body. In the small body you could have a 4-cylinder engine, and in the big body you could either have a 4 or a 6-cylinder engine. The big 4-cylinder car was called, at least for the British made cars, it was called the Big 15, and the 6-cylinder was the Big 6. Also being a 1954 car, this one has the big boot. These days the small boot cars are more popular because the small boot is a lot better looking, but when they were new, the big boot was quite a welcome improvement because the small boot cars had really no boot space, and when they were being used as an everyday car, a bit of extra space was quite welcome. Having a look at the car, the space for the size of it's pretty good. You can fit 5 people in the car. I've actually done so. I did a wedding with this car and had 5 adults in it. It's a little cramped with 5 adults, but it can be done. Obviously the big-bodied cars, being about 20% longer and wider, are a bit better if you want to take more people, but the small-bodied cars handle better and are easier to drive and get around. So when I was looking for this car, I was more interested in having the smaller one. Continuing around the car, this car has been repainted. This is a slightly lighter shade of red than the original, I think it was called Regent Red, would have been, and the interior has also been redone. It would have been leather originally, and it's been redone in vinyl. I also added those extra mirrors. I find them quite useful in modern traffic, and a previous owner has disconnected the trafficators and wired up indicators just for safety, and so they could have driven the car around a bit more. Looking on the other side of the engine bay, one thing that you can see is these rods here, these are actually the gear change. Because it's front wheel drive and the gearbox is out the front, these rods are for first and reverse and for second and third. It's a 3-speed gearbox with synchromesh on second and third, although the synchromesh isn't the greatest, but it is there, and it's probably pretty typical of the cars of its time. As I said before, it's a 4-cylinder engine. It has a mechanical fuel pump, and there's this little priming lever here that you can prime some fuel if you haven't driven the car for a while, which is quite a nice feature. When I got the car, it had a rattly old electric pump, and I replaced it with the proper manual pump, and the car's a lot better for it. One feature on the car that's missing on mine is the heater. So you'll see here there's this ducting that goes through the radiator, and there's a entry into the car. There's supposed to be a tube going in here, and you can control how much airflow comes through. Given that I live in Australia, that it never really gets that cold, and I would have found that would have just gotten in the way of getting to the engine and so on. So I never went and got the right parts to enable the heater on this car. Also, looking at the car from the front, before they had air conditioning and fans and so on, you can actually open the front windscreen, you can open this flap, so you can get really good airflow through the cars. It's quite pleasant to drive even on a summer day once you get to speed with the flow that you get through. From the front, you'll see the Citroen Chevron logo behind the grille. Again, being a British built car, you've got the chromed grille, chromed headlights, some of these extra features that British buyers expected. The French built cars were a little cheaper, and they didn't have those things on for most years. This car, also being a 54, it has the straight bumpers. Some of the earlier cars had smaller, more delicate bumpers, but by 1954 they were using these units. Looking at the interior of the car, the earlier year light 15s had individual seats. This being a 54 has a bench seat. Because it's the light 15, the bench seat is not big enough to seat 3 people across. Even with 2 adults, it's cozy. But it does mean you can slide across and get in from either side. And being a front-wheel drive car, the floor space is flat, so they've got no transmission hump or anything like that. In this car, the dashboard's redone. Originally, the dashboard would have been more of a horizontal grain. This has been done up more like a Jag or something like that when the car was restored, I think, about 10 years or so ago. Having a look at some of the components in the interior, you've got the big steering wheel. Obviously this is unassisted power steering, and being an early front-wheel drive car, it's very heavy at low speeds. It's nicely weighted once you get up to speed, but at parking speeds it's extremely heavy, even with the correct tyres. This is your gear selector. So because it's mounted vertically, there's a lockout, so you can only move the car in and out of gear with the clutch fully depressed. But basically, once the clutch is depressed, you've got reverse, first, cross to second, and then third. As I mentioned, that there are synchros on second and third, but you can't hurry this gearbox. You need to slowly move through the gears, and not being synchronized first gear, you really have to come to a complete stop before you use the gears. Now this has what was now indicators but should be trafficators. Actually, this panel is mounted 90 degrees off. These things should be side to side rather than on top of each other. This is your advance and retard. So these were quite low compression, and with the fuels at the time, you could advance and retard the ignition to run properly. So you've got your ammeter and your fuel gauge. On this car, the fuel gauge doesn't work, neither does the clock. You've got the speedometer, which as you can see doesn't work, but the odometer does work, and I've put about 2,000 kilometers on the car since I've had it. Over here you've got obviously the key, starter button, choke, and the lighting for the instruments. On this you push in for the horn, and then you twist for the lights. And you pull back for main beams. That's pretty much all the controls on the car. It is pretty simple. If you want to open the windscreen, you can first push the wipers out of the way with these, and then you can open the windscreen and get some fresh air into the car. And it opens actually quite a long way. And then down here is the selector for the other flap there. Starting the car is fairly simple. You need to have the clutch pushed in, turn the key on, you've got your oil pressure, idiot light, choke's already out, starter button. And now we're running, and you know, the engine's not a sonorous engine or anything like that, but it's a long stroke engine, so it's got a lot of torque and it's fairly low revving, and once you get up to speed it sort of chuffs along nicely, as you'd expect it to. I'll turn that off now. You've also got your handbrake down here. There's not much in the way of electrics or anything like that on this car. I believe the windscreen wipers are electric, but I've actually never driven this car in the rain, so I don't know how they work. And then you close the windscreen just like this. The other thing to note on this car is that it does have the correct Michelin radial tyres. Michelin owned Citroen at the time, and the correct radial tyres, which are very expensive, a couple of $100 a corner, make a really big difference to how these cars handle. From 1936 onward, these cars had rack and pinion steering, so the steering, while as I said is very heavy at low speeds, once you get up to speed it's really quite direct and better than a lot of cars that were made even 20 years later. It is quite a fun car to drive. I've owned it 4 years and I've really enjoyed it, but it's time to try something new, and so this car's moving up to Brisbane to be with its new owner tomorrow. So that's a bit of a summary of the Traction, or the Light 15. There's probably a few myths about these cars. Parts are actually pretty easy to come by. The only thing that's been a bit hard is some of the trim specific for the British built cars, but most of that is standard Lucas stuff that you can sort of work out what it is. I read an article once that said tall drivers don't fit in these cars. Well, I'm almost 2 meters tall and I fit in it and can drive it just fine. They're not fast, and in stop and go traffic it's maybe not the easiest, the most fun car to drive because it's got a heavy clutch and heavy steering, but once you get it out on the open road it's really quite a lot of fun, and there's probably more of these cars out there than people realize. Maybe not so much in Sydney where I am, but I've certainly seen photos from the Queensland French car display where they had 40 or 50 cars there, and I guess this one's about to go up and join them. Now, I don't have a lot of history for this car, but I did actually run into a gentleman who owned it in the 70s, and he told me that he was a TAFE teacher at the time, and he actually rebuilt the engine in front of his students to sort of as part of a project. Now, one of the things with these engines is, although they're pretty robust engines, they're, as I said, they're overhead valve, wet liner, 1911 cc engines. Probably the biggest Achilles heel on them is they still used white metal or Babbitt bearings, at least when they were new. So when these engines get reconditioned, what people tend to do is they will use later ID19 rods and so on to move to more modern shell bearings that will last longer than the white metal bearings. There's not been any work done to this engine in my ownership, or I believe in the previous owner, so I don't know how long ago work was done. But these engines are pretty robust, and even with the white metal bearings, they can last a long time. They don't have an oil filter, so I've been changing the engine every couple of 100 kilometers. It's probably overkill, but I've owned the car 4 years and done about just under 2,000 Ks, so I've changed it about once, I think once a year since I've owned the car, just to be sure, given that oil's pretty cheap and I didn't really want to have the engine reconditioned. There's a lot of grease fittings on these cars that need to be attended to, so that's probably the other thing, that if someone's looking for them. And they're not hugely expensive. You can get a nice one for about 20,000 Australian dollars for a light 15 like this. The 6-cylinder cars are a lot more expensive, probably at least twice a nice light 15, and there's not that many of them out there. At the time, they were sort of starting to compete with the more established British marques, and so you know, probably the Rovers and these sorts of things. So they didn't sell in nearly as great numbers as these light 15s did. Now, in the comments below, I'll put in some links to some more articles as a period road test, a bit more information about identifying the models and so on. Ideally, I would have taken the car for a test drive, but I actually don't own this car anymore. I've already taken the money from the new owner, so I'm not going to drive it now. I was just sort of going to walk around the car and show you, but I'll also link to some other articles on the car that I have there as well. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the walkthrough of the Light 15, and please add any comments in the comment section. Thanks very much.